Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this Deaf Culture Digital Library's first webinar of the year. My name is Keith Delk. I'm the Deaf Culture Digital Library Program Specialist. I'd like to go ahead and provide a visual description of what I look like. I have a blue button-up on. I'm sitting in a computer chair here. It has the text on it that says Secret Lab. I'm a white man, I'm bald, I have a bit of a beard, and I have a green screen on the side of me, as well as frames in the background of my image. And I just want to make sure that everyone here is comfortable throughout the hour. We are so excited. And if anyone needs any tech support throughout this webinar, please contact me through the chat function. I'll be happy to support you throughout the event. And I'll take the chance to now go ahead and introduce you to our collaborator through Howard County Association for the Deaf. Her name is Heidi, and here she is. Please welcome her. Hello.
Hello, and thank you, Keith, and good evening to everyone. I am Heidi. I am a white female, and I have blonde hair with bangs, tortoiseshell glasses, and I'm wearing a black shirt with a necklace and black earrings. My background is brown. And thank you again, Keith. Howard County Association of the Deaf is truly honored to collaborate with you and the Maryland Digital Library on this exciting book event. It is my pleasure to introduce Teresa Murbach, our president of the Howard County Association of the Deaf. HCAD is the acronym. Teresa has been a dedicated leader and advocate for the deaf community in Howard County. Teresa, welcome.
Hello. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Heidi. To provide a visual description of myself, I'm a white woman. I have brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a black shirt with a necklace that has a heart on it, a pendant. My background is tan. It's really a pleasure to welcome all of you here tonight. And I'm really excited to be part of this very meaningful event. At HCAD, one of our core missions is to spotlight and to raise awareness about deaf authors. For many years, we've had the privilege of being able to partner with the Maryland Deaf Culture Digital Library. We've hosted book events with them, and tonight we're going to be continuing that proud tradition. And thank you, Keith, for partnering with us in order to sponsor this event. I'm looking forward to hearing Phil Bravin and HCAD's own Greg Hlibok discuss one of the most pivotal moments in deaf civil rights history. I hope you all will enjoy listening to Phil and Greg's inspiring conversation as they share their insights and their experiences with the Deaf President Now movement. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. It is my great honor to introduce the esteemed author of the book called Controlling Our Destiny, Dr. Philip W. Bravin, known to many simply as Phil. Now, his career is filled with some remarkable achievements, and I'm only going to focus on the highlights as they relate to Gallaudet University, as shared through his stories in his book. Dr. Bravin served on the Gallaudet Board of Trustees for 20 years and in 1988 became the first deaf chairperson to lead the Presidential Search Committee. His leadership played a pivotal and important role in the historic Deaf President Now, DPN movement. Now, as a result of DPN's success, he was then appointed as the first deaf chairperson for the Board of Trustees, and he served there from 1988 to 1993. Tonight, Dr. Bravin is going to share his insights on the challenges of remaining neutral despite his deep personal desire for a deaf president. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Phil.
Hello.
I think you
Sure.
could just...
My name is Phil Bravin. Thank you, Heidi, for welcoming me. I'm a white male. I have a pink colored shirt on with a blue sweater over it. I have glasses, and behind me are two frames, as well as a white wall. And thank you again for your introduction. I'd like to introduce Greg.
Thank you, Phil. With great excitement, I am honored to introduce our special guest, Greg Hlibok, HCAD's founder and dedicated member, who will be joining Phil for tonight's discussion. A true trailblazer, Greg was one of the four key leaders of this historic Deaf President Now movement. Currently, Greg serves as the Chief Legal Officer for ZVRS and Purple Communications, a leading communication service company. Previously, he played a pivotal role at the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, as the chief of the Disability Rights Office, advocating for accessibility and equal communication rights. Please join me in welcoming Greg Hlibok. Thrilled to be here. I'm a white man wearing a white collared shirt and a navy blue jacket, glasses, and gray hair and white skin. One side of my wall on my left is olive green with picture frames, and the other wall is white door. I look forward to chatting with you this evening.
Sure.
We look forward to hearing the engaging conversation between Phil and Greg tonight. Enjoy, everyone.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone, again. I'm really looking forward to being able to comment a few things about myself, as well as having a discussion with Greg. Thank you, Heidi, Keith, as well as Teresa. Thank you all for hosting tonight's event. And now it's actually been 37 years since the Deaf President Now movement first began. And notice that I use the word movement rather than the word protest. This sign referring to protest is more of a momentary event, but a movement has longer lasting impact. And we are able to see the long lasting impact of Deaf President Now since it happened for quite some time. So I do think that's very important. In the past, we would have called it a protest, but now we can recognize it as a movement for us. Our goal tonight is to share a few tidbits regarding my book, the book that I wrote. I'm not able to tell you everything that's in the book with the few hours that we have, so I'm able to pick out a few things, and I will select a few things that you may not have realized were related to that movement in a few different ways. And again, Greg and I will also share some of our personal backgrounds and how we've known each other and how we've worked together over the years. And I recently went to Sundance Film Festival to the movie premiere of Deaf President Now, as well as the other leaders who were involved in the movement. And I'm here tonight Not to discuss the film about Deaf President now. I don't want to ruin it. This is not a spoiler alert for that movie. You're going to have to wait until that movie comes out on Apple TV, perhaps later this year in the spring or in the summer. We'll have to see when they release that, and then you can watch it yourselves. And when you watch that movie, after having seen our presentation today, you'll be able to see how those two things connect. So yes, I was a board member during Deaf President Now, and many people don't realize that I was also the chair of the search committee that did recommend the 3 candidates to the board. So I played that role before and after the movement. Now I'm going to give it over to Greg, and Greg can explain how our relationship goes way back, all the way back to New York State. Go ahead, Greg.
Thank you, Phil. Definitely, yes. We're both from New York, and he's known me since I was a little kid. I don't know, but he can tell us exactly when. But I know his 3 children, Jeff and I, are close in age. I'd go over to their house, they'd come over to our house. I was involved with the Junior National Association of the Deaf chapter. He was an advisor. My father was also an advisor as well. So great memories, and we've crossed paths in many, many years. At Gallaudet, he was on the board of trustees for Gallaudet. I was involved with the protest. It's not a movement, it was a protest. He became chair, and we'll explain more about how our paths crossed during that week. But we've known each other for many years, and it's a reflection of the deaf community being such a small community. We're both from New York. I'll turn it back over to you, Phil.
Thank you, Greg. So first of all, in our current day as well, we actually work at the same company, ZVRS Purple. So you can see how our paths cross over and over again. Greg and I have this connection over the years. We've been in and out of touch in that way. And we both served on the board of the Lexington School for the Deaf. I did resign from the board, but he is still on the board. Greg is still on the board of the Lexington School for the Deaf. Now we can go ahead and talk a bit about the search committee. Without discussing too much about that process, we did recommend 3 candidates to the board. At that time, the board had quite a discussion, and the individual that they picked was not deaf. It was a hearing woman. There were 2 deaf candidates and 1 hearing candidate, and that was the candidate that the board selected to become president of the university. The student body was shocked and wondering how that could happen. So in anger, they responded. They decided that that was not the right decision, and they went out, they marched from campus to the Mayflower Hotel. They arrived at the Mayflower Hotel on that day, and we were not ready for them. Our committee, we didn't know what to do. We didn't know how to manage that. And those who were there didn't know how to manage this large influx of deaf students entering the building. When it eventually calmed down, the students started commenting, "Deaf President Now." And that was the chant that began at the Mayflower Hotel. They had had a rally before that march, and there had been rallies 2 weeks before that, discussing whether maybe we would have a deaf president. Involved in those rallies were alumni as well as students and community members. It was rather a small group initially of student leaders who were involved in that work, trying to make people more aware of that need for that deaf president of the university and how important that was. And they had been relatively dismissed until that moment. And Greg can explain a little bit more about his involvement in that. Please, Greg, go ahead and take over.
Thank you, Phil. Yes, so truly, it was the first idea of a deaf president. We thought, well, why not? Gallaudet certainly is ready and able to have a deaf president. Now, the National Association of the Deaf broadcast in 1987. I was a student at that time, but the alumni were talking amongst themselves, and several deaf professors and staff members and so forth, they started talking about this, but they had to be very careful because they had to retain their job. So we had a group called the Ducks who were young people who had just recently graduated from Gallaudet. And my brother Stephen was one of those Ducks groups. So they talked to us, student leaders. I was just elected student body government president, and the election happened, the inauguration happened, and then the next day we got to work immediately, drawing up plans, making posters, having a rally on March 1st. Now, my job was to recruit the students and get them involved. Now, during lunch, the students missed lunch. They came and they met and they gathered on the football field, and that's where it started. We thought, should we wait? No, we can't wait. We need to do this right now. Deaf president now. Then the following Sunday, when the students were really involved with the alumni and the Ducks, they all said yes. Within 2 weeks, I was the first, I took over as president. And so we started the Deaf President Now protest. And we did not plan to protest whatsoever. We wanted to put pressure on the Board of Trustees to select a deaf president. Plus, I wrote a letter to Zinzer asking her to consider withdrawing her applications. She was one of the 3 applicants before the meeting of the Board of Trustees. She refused, and we had many different avenues that we were working on. And when they selected Zinzer as the president, we all protested and marched to the Mayflower Hotel.
Right, and you came to the hotel where we were, the board. We were eating, actually, having a meal in the Mayflower when we called the announcement that Zinzer was going to become the next president. We made the announcement, we proceeded as normal. We knew there would be some complaints. So an officer came up to us and to Spillman, the 2 board members, and they said, I just want to let you know, go out there, please help the students calm down. They're quite upset. Maybe if you meet with them, that'll help them calm down. So we agreed, the 3 of us, myself, Spillman, that was Jane Spillman. She was the chair of the board, and myself, I was a board member, and I was the chair of the search committee. So we went out, as well as 2 other hearing board members. The 4 of us went out into the room. One of the hearing board members was a federal judge, and he was sitting there, and the students came up, 3 students. Greg was one of them. They approached us, as well as Tim Raris, who was the president previously before Greg. And the 3rd student was Jerry Covell, who was an alumni, a deaf lawyer. So the 3 of us talked to the 3 of them, and we were discussing. And then what happened to that meeting, some of you may be aware and some of you may not, but Jane Spillman blurted out something very important. She said that deaf people are not ready to function in a hearing world. And that quote, no question, as we've discussed, did she actually say that? People wonder. I'm going to let Greg explain his perspective, and then I'll explain mine.
Now, before Jane had the floor, and before she talked, Judge Penfield Jackson, he was the district court judge in DC. He was a famous man, and he basically explained the Board of Trustees process. Now, the board's process was spot on. They had to follow the rules of the law. Everything worked out as they should. They did not deviate, or there was no bias involved. It was very thorough, exhaustive process that they went through. And basically, they came to tell us that we had no legal grounds to object to their decision. And I said, no. We've got to change the playbook. All along, we've complied with based on qualifications. Zinzer's qualifications were outstanding, but a deaf person was never given an opportunity. I said, let's give that deaf person an opportunity. They can do this job. You've never given a deaf person the opportunity. And Jane Spillman, that's when she came up and she made that conversation. We had a very rapid conversation, and rude, I don't know whether she meant it whether it was a Freudian slip or not, she did say it, and she said, deaf people are not ready to function in a deaf world. And Jeff Rosen stood up and said, you just said what? They argued, they had some words, and Phil was watching. And at that point forward, the meeting and the conversations fell apart. We were there to explain to the crowd. We left, and the interpreters, I went to the interpreter and I said, did she say that? And the interpreter told me, you heard it correctly. Yes. And to this day, she denies saying that statement, but I heard her, I saw her say it, I read her lips, and the interpreter confirmed.
Sure. And let me go ahead and explain my perspective in that room. So you've got that lens, and I'll go ahead and describe sort of what was going on with me in that room. When I saw that quote, I said, I know she may have thought about it. At that time, it had been 8-10 years that the two of us had worked together. And I had no idea that she would say something like that. However, if the interpreter heard what the interpreter thought that they heard, I can't change that. And once again, we had that interpreter there. I had another interpreter who I asked, did she really say that? And the other interpreter said, that room was very loud. And the conversations were going all at the same time. It was noisy. So if maybe she said that, and maybe she could have, but Jane at the time said, no, I couldn't have said that. I didn't say that. I said deaf people are not ready. So that was a double negative that could have been really misunderstood, but that would have really damaged that moment. That was very damaging.
Not that deaf people are not ready. She said they're not ready to function in a hearing world, but
it's
we
over
moved
now.
ahead anyway. We moved forward.
Yep. So, it was very noisy. The other interpreter maybe was not able to catch that. And then we brought that out to the, or that was brought out to the students, to the crowd. It said, can you imagine what Jane said? She said that deaf people are not ready to function in a hearing world. And at that time, the students, the alumni, the faculty, the whole community was enraged. You don't want deaf people to hear you saying something like that. Of course, that's not acceptable. So after that, it really began. So again, the officer came up to us and said, okay, their group is very upset. They're out of control. Can you please go speak to them? So we talked again. We went out and down. We left the building. And when we were walking out, there was one deaf boy who waved me down and pointed at me. And he said, Phil, you are a Judas. And in that moment, I was so struck. I'm a deaf person. I'm a member of the community. And after all that, you're going to call me Judas. As a member of the deaf community, I did not accept that. But I thought about it for a while, and I understood later that boy didn't realize and didn't know that I myself did not vote for Zinza. I voted for a deaf candidate, King Jordan. That was who I voted for. But they didn't know that. So at that time, they wanted to call me Judas without knowing how I'd cast my vote. And the vote was 10-4. All 10 were hearing who voted for Zinzer. The other 4, 3 of them were deaf, and 1 was a hard of hearing woman. So you can see that that's how the vote was actually split. But the damage was done. We went out. They went to the Capitol. The students marched to the White House. The board left. And that's what was done. And the next morning, they gathered again at the field house. And I drove back into the Capitol. I wanted to go in, and the board was supposed to have a meeting. So we were there, and there was a crowd of people there, and students and protesters. So we said, wow, we had to get out of our cars. We couldn't even pull in. We walked up. The students parted. They were respectful to myself, at least, as a deaf member of the community, which was a relief. We walked through the crowd, that parted crowd. Someone ran up and hugged me, and it was actually my son, Jeff, who was a student at Gallaudet at the time. He came up to me, he gave me a hug, he said, Dad, are you okay? I said, yes, I'm okay. I reassured him, and I was able to go about my day. And from there was a building on campus where we had met as the board. We agreed again to meet with the students. So some students came to us, to discuss. And that meeting was when the students got together and they voiced their 4 demands. First was that Jane Spellman needed to resign. Second was that Zinzer needed to resign, and select a deaf president. And then 51% of the board would need to be deaf, and that there would be no punishments for those who had participated in the protests. Those were the 4 demands. The students had discussed and agreed on that. Then we went to a meeting at the field house. And there was a huge crowd there of students, and the board members were there as well. We stood in a line, and I will let you, Greg, explain what happened next with that when you got up on stage.
Yeah, so Harvey Goodstein, he was a professor, and actually he was my math teacher at Gallaudet University. And he was one of the original that were involved. He developed the 4 demands and walked over to the field house where there was a throng of people standing around. And in my mind, we were not planning anything. We were just thinking we wanted to hear what Jane Spellman had to say to the crowd. Even though we knew the answer, that it was they were going to stick with their decision, but we thought we would let her speak. So the stage was right there, and I'm seated right in front, and Harvey came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder, and he said, can I go up there on the stage? And I said, no, wait. He said, no, I want to disrupt them. I said, no, let him talk. He just went on up stage, got up and interrupted before Jane had the opportunity to say anything. He interrupted her, and you may have seen a video clip of where he is saying that the decision is the same, so it's pointless. We're going to stay here. You should just leave. Tried to get the attention, and he stood right smack in front of her. And some people pulled fire alarms and on the campus, and they left, and her speech was null and void. She said nothing. So she stood behind Harvey, and it was very awkward for many of us, and we all left the area.
Yes, now when I think about that moment, Harvey and I had known each other since 2nd grade, actually. So again, thinking about how small that deaf community is. I mean, this was my good friend getting up in front of us. And, I was really torn up to see Greg, who I had known since he grew up from New York. And again, my son, who was a student at Gallaudet, Harvey as well, were all involved in the protest. Those were people who I was close with. And now, as a board member, I had to be separate from them. And as a deaf person, those 2 identities, I couldn't hold them both at the same time. I was struggling to juggle that and know what my role was. But legally, I had a specific role as a board member and working with the board, trying to figure out how we could move on from this. So during those weeks of the protest, Greg and I actually didn't communicate. That Monday meeting, and then after that, we didn't see each other until that end of the week. There were 2 different situations that did come up where Greg and I were both involved. One, Greg had been talking about the meeting with Bonnier, the congressman, Bonner. He was on the Gallaudet Board of Trustees, he could sign a little bit. And the other was a congressman named Gunderson, who was also hearing and could sign a bit. Greg and I met with them, and would you mind explaining the meeting, Greg?
Before you say something, we left the field house. I have something funny to say here. We left the field house while Jane Spellman was saying something. We didn't know where we were going. We're just marching. We were going to march down Florida Avenue, but the police came up and they were saying, no, you have to have a permit in order to march. And we didn't have a permit. And one person went up and spoke with the police officer, and the police officer told the person and said, you cannot proceed without a permit. And then they announced to the students, the police said, go ahead and march. So we we marched. It was illegal. It was an illegal march. We had no license or permit. It was during rush hour, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We held up traffic and we marched from Gallaudet to the White House to Lafayette Park, right across from the White House. And then on Wednesday, Congressman Boyer called us all together into his office, and Connor into our office, along with Jack Gannon, the executive director of the Gallaudet alumni, and Jane Norman, and a bunch of other people. We all went in and we're like, basically, where do we stand? We wanted to try to get a pulse. And we said, no, 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 we are very serious. We are not bending. We will not bend. These are our demands. And I explained the history and I said, the time is now for a deaf president, but they were fair to us and they listened. And I believe that that meeting had an influence on the board because we were clear that we were at a point of no return at that meeting. Our demands remained the same and our momentum was increasing significantly.
Yes, that afternoon, I did go to that meeting with the congresspeople, Jane Spillman and Elizabeth Zinser. We attended the meeting, we all sat, and we listened to the comments. When the congresspeople left, we were thinking about this issue. We were talking about it, a congressperson came up to me and I ignored them initially. And then 10 or 15 more congresspeople came up. They said, we heard about what's happening at Gallaudet. And I thought, wow, okay. So I put that to the back of my mind, realized that. We actually had over 50, maybe 75 congresspeople coming around talking about they were hearing what had happened at the Gallaudet board. And, then we decided to take action and go ahead. They wanted to meet with Greg, myself as well, and Jane Spillman. So we really wanted to put that thought into whether Spillman Zinser should resign or whether we should move on. But at the time we decided as a group to stick with our decision. At that time, the meeting was not effective, but there was pressure. And then that evening...
And sorry to interrupt, Phil, but you mentioned that many congressmen were contacting Boyer because it makes sense. Because in that time, 1988, the congressman always read the newspaper every single morning, and our protests were headlines. They were seeing that everywhere, and they were asking Boyer what was up because they saw our protest front page news ahead of all the rest of the news in the newspapers.
Yes, and in my book, I have covers from the Washington Post. Every day, these protests were front page in Washington, D.C. They weren't page 10, they weren't page 15. They were the top story on the front page every day of the protest. People couldn't ignore it. They couldn't miss it. It was amazing. And then imagine on Tuesday, there was actually an election. But what was the first thing at the top of the page on Super Tuesday? Gallaudet University protests. That was the kind of impact that it had. So again, we had that event in the evening, that meeting, and then Spillman as well was involved in that meeting. We talked, and then we had an interview with Ted Koppel on Nightline. Spillman was there, Marley Matlin was there, and there was also an interpreter there. And they were a bit confused because there was a female interpreter for the male speakers, so that was a bit confusing, but Ted Koppel did ask Zinser, are you, as far as the board is concerned, are you considering resigning? That evening, that Nightline interview was out. The next morning, Zinser decided to resign. And that resignation opened up everything. Then we were able to move forward. That was the movement. If she had not resigned, the board was not going to change their mind. They were going to keep that. But when Zinser made that move, that gave the board the opportunity to move forward. And then on Friday, Greg, can you please explain the march to the Capitol?
Yes, it brings back fond memories. Wednesday night was the deadline. Zinser, after, we met with Zinser a few times prior to that. We had interviews with PBS NewsHour, CBS, Evening News, NBC, various other news stations, cordial meetings. And she was a very nice person. She shook hands, but the night afterwards, she disappeared and stayed in the bathroom. And the interpreter and I were talking. We were waiting for her to come out. And the interpreter informed me that she sounded like she was in there crying. So we left. And then the next day, we had 3 appointments to interview with her. And she did not show up. She canceled. And that was when I knew. And that evening, I flew up to New York for a Friday morning Good Morning America ABC interview early in the morning. I flew up to New York Thursday. Was it Thursday night? No, it was actually the Today Show. I'm sorry. Flew up. When I got there, I found out that she had announced that she was resigning. So I was in New York celebrating. Then I returned after the Tonight Show. I flew back, arrived, and joined the march. And the march, I just had goosebumps. I was just so thrilled. There were tons and tons of people, thousands and thousands of people marching. It was, I still have a banner. We just all marched. And I looked as far back as I could see, 6, 7 blocks behind me. Everybody was marching. Perfect weather. We had 70-degree weather. The sun was shining. Everybody was in great spirits. It was Deaf Pride moment, National Deaf Pride moment as we were marching and walking. Congressman came out and spoke to us. Senator Harkin, he then became our friend because his brother was deaf. He was a key author of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. He came, he spoke to us, and it was at that point we knew that we had it. But when was it? We didn't know. That was something we didn't know.
Yes, exactly. And I was stuck in New York, but I really wanted to march myself as a deaf person. But of course, as a board member, I wasn't able to do that. However, my sister and my father were both involved in the march, but I wasn't. During that week, again, I had that conflict, that internal conflict, but I had to do my duty as a board member during the course of that week. And many people in the community did ask myself and other board members, as well as Frank Servin and Bob Sanderson, the 3 of us were the deaf board members. They asked us to resign, but we decided that we refuse that request. And looking back, I think it was very important because if we had resigned, there would have been no deaf voices on the board at all. The outcome would have been completely different. So we decided to stay. And I think about that often. Resigning was not the answer, and I still agree with that choice. And then Sunday, please take it away.
Let me add, the march included people from all over. Rochester sent 4 buses of NTID students down. People came from all over the nation. My father, mother came, my brother, Bruce came. He was the older brother. They all joined in the march. So there were many people who took the day off to join in the march. I would just wanted to throw that out there and mention it.
Yes. And that was a working day, right? That was over the weekend. There were so many people involved in that protest. That Sunday, the board met and we talked. And again, we had those 4 demands to discuss. And the board decided to accept the resignation of Spillman as well as a board member. She did resign as chair of the board, as well as board member generally. And then we talked about the 51% rule. That was very complex. But we did set up a task force able to make that decision of how we could restructure the board to have 51% deaf membership. And that last one, we decided not to punish any of the students, faculty, or staff who participated or did not participate in the protest at that time. And again, the board did decide to select I, King Jordan, as the president of Gallaudet. So we accepted those resignations. I remember King, I was wondering, how am I going to tell him that we selected him? I can't announce it to the public first without having told King himself. So I called him. I called I, King Jordan. I let him know. He accepted that naming of him as the president, but we didn't tell the public still. I said, I know there are some deaf people that we have to tell first. So then I called Greg on TTY. And at that time, the phone use was a little bit different. So I'll let Greg explain that.
So that's Sunday during the day. Actually, let's say, no, wait, Sunday. I was wondering, and I heard rumors about the board having a meeting, which meant that they would decide who would be the president. But I wasn't sure, was the board going to postpone and have an interim and start all over again for the search for the president, or choose one of the other two as the president? So we patiently waited. And then later in the afternoon, I was in the field house. Somebody came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, the board, Phil has asked for you. And I thought, Phil's asking for me. Okay, fine. So they said, hurry up, hurry up. He's on the old gym on the other side of campus. So they said, hurry up, hurry up. So they pulled up a van. It was a Gallaudet van. I got in the van. When I got in, it was they left the door open, and they didn't even shut the door, and they sped around the campus. I got out, and everybody was looking at me, and there was a TTY there, and I walked in, everybody's looking to see what was going on. I went into an office with a glass enclosure, and everybody was just watching. It was a very small room, and they're watching me on the TTY. And I opened and I said, hi, this is Greg. And he said, who are your siblings? And I was a little confused. I was young, and I'm like, I'm 20. And I'm thinking, well, why is he asking me who my siblings are? He was trying to verify that I was Greg and not someone else conversing with him. So I gave him the names of all my brothers and my sister, and then the answer was correct. So we had our conversation.
Yes, and I told you again that we had met and we decided, and you started celebrating, and everyone celebrated all night into the morning. And that morning, Greg and I and King, the president, we met, and you made a very important statement. Can you please tell us about that?
And as you mentioned, we confirmed that everything would go back in order after all of the 4 demands were met, 51% majority. And I said, we need to make sure before we proceed, you have to accomplish the 51 being majority deaf on the board. And you said it couldn't be done overnight. It couldn't happen overnight because of logistics. But as we discussed, we had to trust his word that he would accomplish that last demand. And, I know some people were like, no, 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 no. And I trust Phil. I've known Phil for many years, and I know he's going to keep his word. And then also no reprisals. And we would go back and have order on campus. The next morning, Phil came on campus, and there was not a protest going on. Everything was back in order, and he was relieved. And I went to the minor building, and we and King Jordan and Phil discussed plans for what was going to happen next. Then we went over to an official press conference, and it felt a little strange to me that the first time in history, in 124 years of having a board chair and a president and the student body government president meeting without an interpreter. It was mind-blowing. We were able to communicate in our native language with each other. It was awesome.
Yes. So on that note, we can close out. The book is titled Controlling Our Destiny. And again, controlling our destiny and thinking about how deaf folks will control our destiny in the future. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Heidi and Keith to continue with the event. Wonderful. Wow. This is the second time that I've seen Phil make those comments regarding his view of the movement. And out after having read his book, I can't stop thinking about the jaw-dropping things that were done. And, off camera, Heidi and I were talking about how amazing and how impactful this conversation was. I'm so thrilled that we were able to host this. And moving forward, we're going to have some question and answer for the last 10 minutes of this event. So again, audience, we're gonna answer your questions first. Heidi and I will take turns asking questions of Greg and Phil on your behalf. So the first question that I have here is an anonymous question. We don't know who submitted it, but they mention when they visited Gallaudet University and saw the Blazers during the protest, they had buttons on them that said 31 and a half. Is that related to the 4 demands? Not in that last one, not being completely met. Are you able to explain the meaning of the buttons that said 3.5? Greg, Phil, can you expand on that, please?
Yes. And my answer, because I was the one who wore the buttons, 3.5. It was actually when Zinzer resigned and we met half of the requirements. They had to have a deaf president. Zinzer resigned. That became the half. And the other 3 remaining requirements. That's where the the symbolism of 3.5. That was announced Thursday night. And then Friday we had the march. We wore the badge, the buttons that said 3.5. So 3.5 of our requirements or our demands were met.
Oh, thank you for clarifying that and explaining that. So those Blazers, there was just the one. You didn't do 3, 2, 1, just the
So
one?
no, 3.5 until Sunday evening when Phil told us that they had met all 4 of the requirements. Then we did not change out the buttons. But technically, we could have one more because Phil wants to answer because when we accomplished. But I'll let Phil explain it.
Correct. So again, we didn't meet that last one, and I was a deaf chair, so I couldn't have commented at the time. But again, I was there, and as a student, Greg was able to wear that. I couldn't.
Yes, and you promised within 2 years we would accomplish our
It was
demand.
really 3 years that we were able to get that 51%.
Well,
We
yeah.
accomplished that goal of 51% board members being deaf in 3 years. We couldn't just tell the hearing people to leave and bring in a deaf person. I actually wasn't able to do that when I became chair of the board. So we had to increase the level of comfort, right, that they had. So we had to comfortably wait for them to leave, replace them with deaf board members, because we had a limit of 21 board members. We couldn't actually increase the number of board members allowed. So that number in my position, we couldn't change that. It was in the bylaws. So we had 21 members limit. And then over the course of that 3 years, we were able to satisfy the 51% requirement.
Yes, and to go full circle, I've served on the board of Gallaudet. Gallaudet now has 21 members. 3 are pretty much automatically hearing people. They're from Congress. The remaining 18, and at one point, actually, there were 11 deaf members and 10 hearing members. So just barely did we meet that quota, the 51%. But now we still have the majority of deaf members represented on the board of trustees at Gallaudet. And every time I hear you speak, Greg, and Phil, I'm always inspired. Anything to do with Deaf President Now. My daughter was young. She studied in history. She had a history project and she did Deaf President Now. She won a prize for that in the state of Maryland. But I do have another question for you. And I can't think of anyone else better to be on the board of trustees than you, Greg. But this question is very important. One person, Tracy Salway, is asking, now you mentioned 7 ducks. What's the reason for using the term ducks and who were they?
That one's for Greg. I'm not sure what that was. The 7 ducks, you mentioned that?
Sure. We mentioned Jeff Rosen, who we were in a meeting with Spillman. He was one of the ducks. And at that time, there was a handful of deaf attorneys, very small number, maybe 20 or less deaf attorneys. Now we have a large number, over 300 deaf attorneys. Jeff was one. My brother, Stephen, was the another one. Mike O'Donnell was one. Fred Weiner. I'm trying to remember who the 5th one is. James Tucker, Paul Singleton, and I'm in trouble. Am I in trouble? Yes, I'm in trouble. I forgot one person. Well, there were 6 or 7 members of the duck group. There was another person, but I can't name them because I need to get their permission. But those were the ones that I would like to mention. Heidi's saying, okay.
And you mentioned that name of the ducks. The person was wondering, the leaders of DPN, yes, but they were also involved in Purple. You both mentioned that you were not only leaders with DPN, but you've gone on to work at Purple's EVRS. So now, how do you feel? Being able to bring all of this information, this 37 years of experience since then that you've described in the book, and you mentioned that blessing of that experience, that now you have the experience, you can share that. What does it feel like to finally get that out there? Yes, I do have some guilt actually, because I've really wanted to express this information over the years, this whole time. But before, I'm the only surviving deaf member of the board at that time now. Until then, I didn't want to tell the stories of those other folks. And I had, they had commitments to their families. I had commitments to my family, my wife, things like that. And yes, I waited almost 20 years actually until I started experiencing that desire to comment. That first period of time, I was concerned because many of the board members were still alive. There were some legal issues that maybe had not resolved yet. When all of that resolved, I decided that it was time. And I was able to do that. We were able to move forward with that. I asked Gallaudet for permission to go and look through the documents, and I was able to do that. And when I did that, I was ready to write. And honestly, I feel so much peace being able to share that story and give that. I'm able to ask questions, get that full experience, and share my side of the story. I really enjoy that. I was also wondering, the student leaders, were you aware that information from the protest, aware of Phil's perspective on the leaders? What did that look like between those two groups?
Well, after the protest, no, I was told, Phil told me that the meeting and the discussion and everything was sealed, a sealed document. We could not open that until 50 years had passed. So it's
Right.
sealed. So what's inside and the discussions inside, we don't know until Phil, I guess it was about 5 years ago,
7 or 8 years ago, yeah.
ASD, he told us he was going to publish a book. And so he managed to get, I don't know, permission from the Board of Trustees to open and get information for his research for his book. And so here we are. We're bringing this conversation back again because oftentimes we get questions about how did it all start? When did it actually happen? And what was happening behind the scenes? Well, Phil was behind the scenes, and many of the several books that we've read about Deaf President Now were more, about the day the world heard Gallaudet, but that was from the public's view of what happened. But nothing was behind the scenes like this one is. And we thought that maybe one day, we would see some writings about that, and here we are.
And again, you mentioned related to that permission, I had said that I was hoping to write this book, but I really did need access to the materials from the board meetings. I knew that they'd said they'd be sealed for 50 years. I remember that. I did write a letter actually to the president of Gallaudet as well as the chair of the board asking permission to unseal that and have access. And they said, we're so sorry, we have a rule. This is going to be sealed for 50 years. You can't access those documents. And I said, who made that rule? Who was on the board? And they said, let's look. That was Phil Bravin who recommended that rule to the board. So actually, I did that to myself. So again, we kept talking, and eventually they decided to give me permission to that information and unseal it. And that's what I'm able to share that story with you now.
Phil, I can't imagine the turmoil, what you went through. Here you have a deaf family, you have deaf friends, you're in the deaf community, and the angst you must have felt. But, I can't think of a better man than you. You were very professional, you were very neutral, and then you wrote this book, and I love the book, and I encourage everyone to read the book. And now I do have a question that has been thinking, you're a very smart man. When you first asked to lead the Presidential Search Committee, you selected key people to work with, people that you could trust. Ms. Holt, do you have any insights and did she guide your decision? What was it? What was the strategic choices made based on her skills? Did you have a sense of something, or how did that go?
Well, first of all, there are two parts of your question. So picking Lil and selecting the search committee, those are two different parts. Lil was already, I have no organizational skills myself. That still, I'm not organized to this day. I have no organizational skills. I'm nothing. So I knew that Lil was the board liaison with the president's office. So the board was already familiar with her and had been for quite some time, and I was already impressed with her work. And we worked well together. So results spoke for themselves. I thought, well, we can go ahead and plan to have Lil help us. This looks good. So we recruited her. And then as far as the board getting together and talking about the search committee, I think first, the majority of the search committee, of the board members, I apologize, was going to be involved in the search committee. And most of them were going to be deaf. And then the rest were selected of the hearing members as well. And then we also had students representations. We had faculty, staff, board members, and students. Some of them were deaf, and some of them were women as well, deaf women. So we tried to create that search committee in a rather diverse way. There were 11 folks involved. Wonderful. And we do have several more questions, but our hour is up. We're all out of time. Oh, that's unfortunate. But I did want to ask Greg and Phil if both of you wouldn't mind following up with these remaining questions after the meeting. We can post it on our Deaf Culture Digital Library website, and then folks can go see the answers to their questions there. And that will also help us get a little bit deeper into your work and into the answer of these questions and learn more about this amazing movement. So with that, I'm going to have to thank everyone for coming to this event. And to wrap up, Heidi, do you have any final comments? Greg, Phil, anyone else want to say anything? Final comments to wrap up the event tonight?
Greg, I've been wondering, it's been 37 years since the protest. In those 37 years, we've been quiet for a while. People don't really talk about it. Many young people, we ask, do you know about the Deaf President Now movement? They don't know. You know your rights with the ADA to have captions on TV and interpreters? They don't realize that this was a result of the work of the former ancestors, including DPN, including my parents, Phil, his parents. Now it's come up again with Phil's book and the DPN movie that's coming out, that's going to be released. The time is ripe for us to understand our deaf history and the impact that those occurrences happen, not because they just happen, it's because our ancestors who have helped to make this happen. We have to thank them for doing things that have improved the lives of our young generation who are now benefiting from their ancestors.
Yes, and in the book as well, I do have a section there where, we need to preserve this history. Now, politically, we have a lot more rights that we used to have, and we need to protect those and protect those rights that we've earned for ourselves, for our community.
Exactly.
And that has been given to us over generations, their knowledge, their work over the years. We need to continue their fight today. And it's just more important than ever. You can see laws being passed that we've been working on, and currently more laws being passed. And that has to stop. All right. Thank you all. Thank you.
It's an honor and privilege to have you with us. Thank you. And I know you both are very busy, especially, one of you have just come back from Sundance
Yes, that's a
Film
Sundance.
Festival.
Yep.
You've got both have come back from that, and we look forward to seeing the film, which is going to come in June. Greg is saying it's going to be on Apple TV. Thank you so much again for participating.
Yes. What a time to be alive.
time.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.